This program is brought to you in part by the Paul B. Hunter and Constance D. Hunter Charitable Foundation, a proud partner of WUCF and the Central Florida community.
On this edition of Florida Road Trip, we're headed to Florida's northern gateway, Nassau County, where history flows from the rails of Callahan to the shrimp docks of Fernandina Beach.
When the British took over Florida in 1763, they wanted to connect the new colony of Florida to the rest of their colonies. They built a road called the King's Road.
Then sail across centuries to Amelia Island. Legacy was written and grand Victorian homes still stand.
This island has kind of changed hands 8 times. You have a lot of different people from a lot of different places who bring their cultures and their ideas here.
Plus, step onto the sand of American Beach, built on the vision of Florida's first black millionaire.
He called it American Beach Resort for recreation and relaxation without humiliation.
From colonial crossroads to coastal culture to a seaside sanctuary born of resilience, it's all waiting here in Nassau County. Buckle up, Florida Road Trip is back on the road and ready to explore. Hi there and welcome to Florida Road Trip. I'm Scott Feiss. We're in Nassau County, the northernmost point in Florida's East Coast, and a place where the past is never far away. From old railroads to shrimp boats to centuries worth of change, this is a place where history runs deep. We begin on the west side of the county, where these lands were shaped by rail, turpentine, and timber. It's here in Callahan where the new Florida frontier took root.
When the British took over Florida in 1763, they wanted to connect the new colony of Florida to the rest of their colonies, Georgia and South Carolina. In order to do that, they built a road called King's Road that connected St. Augustine up to Charleston and Savannah. It passed through here. It went inland because the tributaries near the coast are really large and it's hard to build bridges.
Even some well-known names once journeyed down these historic paths.
East Florida was a new territory, so they wanted to explore Florida. Daniel Boone came down in 1765. He didn't write much about it, but he did come down. He visited St. Augustine, wasn't really impressed, so he traveled out to West Florida and was really interested. Maybe he would have moved there if it wasn't for his wife, Rebecca, who said no. Ironically, we've heard of William Bartram. Him and his dad came in this area the same year. His dad was a botanist for the Royal British government, and they came down to Florida.
In the 1850s, another trailblazer helped reshape the area. Senator David Yulee, who laid the tracks by bringing rail to the region, inspiring the birth of a new town.
He lived in Fernandina, and his idea was to connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Gulf of Mexico by railroad because it was too treacherous for ships to go around the Straits of Florida and Key West. In 1855, they started in Fernandina. They hired a man called Daniel Callahan to build the railroad. It took them a year to cross over from Amelia Island over to mainland Nassau, and by the summer of 1856, they reached this point here, which is the King's Road.
Across the county on Amelia Island, the stories go back even further. This area is famously known as the Isle of 8 Flags.
This island has kind of changed hands 8 times at least over the course of its history. So first you have the French, they show up and they settle here. Eventually the Spanish come and take over, they're here for a little while. The British get a hold of it for a little while, the Spanish take it back. Eventually it becomes part of the United States, and then it becomes part of the Confederacy for a little bit, and then it's back to the United States. What that means is you have a lot of different people from a lot of different places who bring their cultures and their ideas here.
Over time, the island became a battleground of empires and crossroads of commerce. Even its name, Amelia, was part of the effort to impress the British crown.
So that actually comes from the Georgia governor, Oglethorpe. At the time, Georgia was still a British colony, and he was getting a little twitchy because the Spanish were so close to him. His idea was if he named the island after the British king's favorite daughter, Amelia, it would make it more attractive to say, hey, we should have this thing.
While the island's name reflects the effort to gain favor with the British crown, Fernandina Beach pays homage to Spanish King Ferdinand. The strategic location of Amelia Island made it valuable for military defense. On its northern tip, Fort Clench, a brick fortress that watched over the coastline since before the Civil War. Construction on the fort began in 1847, but before it reached completion, the fort was occupied with troops. Later, Fort Clench became one of Florida's first state parks in 1935. But in World War II, Fort Clench again played a role of protection with just one last job to do, serving as a joint center for surveillance and communications.
Essentially, you went from missions to plantations. Over the course of time, especially with the Civil War and everything else, the industry kind of had to pivot. And so in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, that's when they call it the golden age of Fernandina. That's when you see those big Victorian houses, and that's kind of the first tourism boom.
Many of those who shaped the island's seafood legacy were Greek and Sicilian immigrants who turned Fernandina Beach into a shrimping powerhouse.
And they start staking their livelihood on the shrimping industry. And so they start putting motors on boats, and then they do a lot of interesting things with nets, like the big trawls to drag along the bottom and get them. And that kind of holds this place up for a period of time because there's a big lull in business for a few decades until tourism really starts to pick up again.
History and lore on full display at the Amelia Island Museum of History. Housed inside a former county jail, it's packed with everything from shrimping artifacts to centuries-old mission relics, with one fan favorite bubbling up, the soda fountain.
It's such a fun thing, and kids love it too. We have a lot of things that were donated from families who have been here forever, so you get to kind of parse through, and it's a kind of fun, little more personal look at the history of the island that I think is really enjoyable.
Back in Callahan, history lives on through a tiny yet mighty train depot, originally built in 1881 and lovingly restored by the community.
We're actually on the David Yulee Railroad bed, 1856. They renovated it and then they opened it up in 1988. It was a library at one time and a meeting room, and then it's just evolved into the Historical Society's museum.
There's a lot of history in the old depot, with two items that sing their own tune.
Drumheads were on the back of passenger trains, and it's a specially made one. The Shriners, it's Morocco Temple, it's a Gator logo. I think it was on the special train from Jacksonville to Gainesville when they went to Gator games or the Gator Bowl games. And also we have what we call a chickering piano. It's called a square piano. The real ivory keys, that unfortunately, they stopped making chickering pianos in the 1890s.
From timber to trains, from indigenous roots to immigrant grit, Nassau County is more than just a place on the map. It's a living timeline of Florida history. The American Revolutionary War arose from growing tensions between the British and the colonists of the original 13 colonies. And although Florida wasn't part of the original 13, what happened here in Nassau County directly impacted the war. The Florida Territory was the property of Spain until 1763, when the British acquired possession of the land.
When the British took over Florida from the Spanish in 1763, they divided the old Spanish province of Florida into two colonies. There was East Florida with the capital in St. Augustine, and West Florida with the capital in Pensacola.
With the American colonies to the north rebelling against Great Britain, Florida was crucial to the British war effort.
We invaded Canada because Washington didn't want the British at his northern border. So why would he be okay with the British being on his southern border?
So he thinks it's a priority for the United States to have the Floridas for American security. Not for its economy, not for the people who live there. It's just a bunch of sand and some pine trees. We don't really want it, but we have to have it.
It wasn't like Washington was bored. He was personally overseeing the siege of Boston. He had an army invading Canada at the same time. And now he's calling for a third front as far away from everything else as you can possibly get. That's how significant they felt what was going on down here.
The swampy terrain along the Georgia-Florida line made entering East Florida from Georgia a major obstacle. Continental troops found themselves navigating the swamps, rivers, and the Atlantic Ocean along Kings Road.
Any land invasion from the north has to cross a lot of rivers and creeks. One of the major engineering public works projects that the British had was to create a road connecting Georgia across the St. Mary's River down to New Smyrna and a little bit beyond New Smyrna. This invasion force was using that road.
Florida's swampy. Callahan is low, and it's only 22 feet above sea level. It's very swampy. You had to, weave around estuaries and swamps and stuff. Whoever controlled that road controlled the entry into Florida at the time.
This path put Nassau County as a prime location for conflict during the American Revolution, as its population was largely made up of immigrants, and those with strong ties to the British Crown. Immigrants included those from England and Scotland, along with loyalists from the rebellious colonies to the north, residents like the East Florida Rangers, and many Native Americans. Nassau County became a vital region for the British, all in an effort to protect St. Augustine. The city to the south became an important target for the Continental forces, as St. Augustine served as a British hub for stockpiling goods, troops, and weaponry.
Washington authorizes 5 separate invasions of East Florida at various points. The goal is St. Augustine. Trying to take St. Augustine and the Floridas off the board, get them out of British hands, was something that was strategically important.
It would have been a devastating blow if the Patriots could have captured St. Augustine. They would have captured and ran the British off the continent.
In May of 1776, the first attempt came as Georgia militia and colonial forces had taken control of a large section of land in East Florida between the St. Mary's River and the St. Johns River. But their position and control was soon weakened by swamp fever, poor morale, and the prying eyes of spies.
The only reason they got the American army out of that wedge between the St. Mary's and St. John's is they sent spies into the camp and spread the rumor that there were 2,000 Cherokee warriors raiding the Georgia backcountry, and you guys need to get home, and they took off. So that was the first attempt.
The second attempt came about a year later, in May of 1777, at the Battle of Thomas Creek near Callahan.
This time, the Americans got as far as Thomas Creek. The East Florida Rangers and British Army came up out of St. Augustine. Major Mark Prevost, the general's brother, had done an end around with his army, and they settled in at Thomas Creek, and Thomas Brown and the militia coming out of St. Augustine drove them right into the British cannons waiting at Thomas Creek, and it was an annihilation.
Only 6 months later, the Continental Army tried a third attempt that would lead to the Battle of Alligator Creek Bridge. The skirmish started at Fort Tonin, a British fort built in Nassau County, about 25 miles up the St. Mary's River from St. Augustine.
There was a battle at Fort Tonin, but it was actually a ruse. The idea was the Americans were going to attack there, so the British burned the fort, took off in this race to get away, but always just within sight. They weren't really trying to get away. They got as far as Alligator Creek Bridge in Callahan, and they peeled off, and the Americans came right into Mark Prevost's cannons again. It was just a repeat of Thomas Creek, just in the other direction.
Although George Washington sought further attempts to invade East Florida, all of those went unexecuted. The conflicts here in Nassau County protected St. Augustine as a hub for the British operation, leaving East Florida under British control for the rest of the war. Welcome to American Beach. This strip of shore on Amelia Island is rooted in history and the spirit of the Gullah Geechee people, whose roots stretch all the way from the Carolinas here to Florida's northeast coast. The Gullah Geechee are descendants of enslaved Africans brought to the southeastern coast of the United States.
The Gullah Geechee people are people who are native to the eastern Atlantic coast from North Carolina through Florida.
Because these coastal communities sat on barrier islands with limited access to the mainland, their culture, languages, and traditions remained intact for generations.
Gullah is a very animated language, so within a short amount of words, you would sometimes be able to tell a whole paragraph. Like if you said, the man went whoppity wop over yonder yesterday. Now that means that the man ran very fast and in the direction that the person would be pointing. Yesterday was not like yesterday, it was like past, in the past. So the question might have been, where did the man go? And that would be the answer. Man ran whoppity wop over yonder there yesterday. So you would have explained that entire paragraph as to what happened, how fast he ran, as you answered the question.
That same cultural identity is tied to the land that holds the history of enslavement, emancipation, and the communities built on Amelia Island.
Amelia Island was the Harrison plantation. After the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln in 1863, way before the Emancipation was ratified, 1863 and 4, he sent his Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and Sherman, General Sherman, to Fernandina to say, I need you guys to spend time in the South to understand what would happen to the enslaved people once they are free. So they did just that. They went from Charleston down to Jacksonville initially and came back to Fernandina. Sherman made the Special Order 15 that said land of the Confederates would be taken. There will be 400,000 acres from Charleston to Jacksonville that they would take and then carve it into 40 acres per plantation. Why? That 40 acres would be given to the enslaved people to start their new life. So this Harrison plantation deeded that 40 acres right next to where American Beach is right now, and it was called Franklin Town.
But segregation meant even the ocean wasn't always open to everyone.
There is a law in 1924 in Jacksonville that said no white person and no Negro person can bathe on the ocean within 500 feet from each other.
Enter A.L. Lewis, Florida's first black millionaire, president of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, and the visionary behind American Beach.
And in 1935, 33 acres of what we now call American Beach was purchased. And the vision that A.L. Lewis had to have black folk come to a place, called it American Beach Resort. And this is the quote of A.L. Lewis, quote, for recreation and relaxation without humiliation, end quote.
But in 1964, Hurricane Dora devastated the area. That same year, the Civil Rights Act opened access to all beaches. The combination meant American Beach's heyday faded until one determined woman stepped in, the Beach Lady.
After her opera career, she began to write to all kinds of newspapers and magazines and on the news about American Beach and say, you got to understand what American Beach is and da 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 da. And people would write about it. But until that designation, it became something cemented in and registered in the archives of the government.
American Beach stands as more than just a vacation spot. It's a living link to the Gullah Geechee corridor and illustrates what can happen when a community preserves its history.
Here in Nassau County, my neighbors are still in the same county, on the same barrier island where they had been enslaved since the 1700s, and they continue to own land.
And one tradition that continues to connect the past to the present is music. Groups like the Duval County Ring Shouters share songs and rhythms rooted in African traditions and shaped by the Gullah Geechee people. From the rhythms of the language to the spiritual song, their culture reflects the same resilience that built American Beach. Those stories of the past continue to inspire future generations. Welcome to St. Mary's, Georgia, a quiet coastal community just across the river from Florida. It's here across state lines that the St. Mary's Submarine Museum dives deep into the history and might of the U.S. Navy and their underwater operations found along Florida's coastline. At the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. Navy entered a new era, one that would take some of its fleet beneath the waves. The first step came with the purchase of a vessel designed to operate underwater.
We started in 1900 when the Navy bought its first submarine, the USS Holland, from John Holland, one of our early submarine inventors, in April of 1900. Along with Simon Lake and some others, were the early pioneers of the submarine force.
Those early subs were small and slow. Before World War II, 9 were lost. But as the technology slowly advanced, so did their role in combat.
During the second half of the war, we took out over 60% of the shipping in the Pacific, but we paid a very heavy price for that. We lost 52 submarines and over 3,500 men.
After the war, submarines transitioned from diesel to nuclear power. In 1958, the USS Nautilus became the first sub to cross under the North Pole.
That was really a game changer for Arctic operations, the first time that had ever been attempted.
Today, the submarine force is spread across 7 home ports in the United States and overseas, each with its own role in protecting the nation.
In the submarine force, we have currently we have 7 bases that are submarine home ports. We have Groton, Connecticut, which is strictly submarine-based fast attacks, a squadron in Norfolk, the main East Coast Navy base, but we have a submarine squadron there. We have Kings Bay here. On the West Coast, we have a submarine base at Ballast Point outside of San Diego there. The Bangor, Washington base, which is our sister base to here. They have 10 Trident submarines based there, as well as the 3 Seawolf class, the Connecticut, the Seawolf, the Jimmy Carter. And then we have fast attack submarines in Pearl Harbor, and we have 5 submarines home ported in Guam.
Inside the St. Mary's Submarine Museum, visitors can trace that history through rare artifacts, intricate models, and personal stories.
We have a periscope that goes through our room here and up through the attic, and you can see across the river to Fernandina Beach. It's one of our most popular attractions here in the museum. That happens to be a great example of the partnership that we have with the Navy base. That's on loan to us, belongs to the Navy.
Among the museum's most unique possessions is its collection of World War II war patrol reports.
Our boats did over 1,600 war patrols. This is from the USS Bumper, their first war patrol in 1945. We have between 95–98% of all the war patrols that were done in our files here. It's an amazing collection. Think of it as a diary of what transpired on the boat that day. The war patrol reports from World War II document the battles they had, the ships they sunk, personnel that they lost. So those are a unique snapshot in history of that particular boat. Some of the boats, did 13 patrols, some did 1. It just depended. The battle flags are a representation of what happened during that patrol. You'll have a rising sun flag indicating warships that were sunk. You'll have a regular Japanese flag indicating merchant ships that were sunk. They all convey the same message, just all in their own unique way. The other thing that's on the battle flags is parachutes with stars or a broken propeller or hash marks next to it representing Allied pilots that were rescued. The most famous U.S. pilot rescued by an American submarine during World War II was President Bush.
From U.S. presidents to decades of documents, the museum tells the story of local, national, and international stories of submarine history. And proving time can heal wounds, More than 200 years after the American Revolution, the British are again welcome and active in this part of Florida.
A lot of people don't know that the British come here and have 4 missile boats, the Vanguard, the Vigilant, Victorious, and Vengeance. And those submarines carry our missiles on their boats. So they come here to Kings Bay to load and offload missiles. It was a win-win for both countries. It got them out there with us, making patrols against the Soviet Union faster, and that has stayed in place till today.
At the St. Mary's Submarine Museum, history just isn't behind glass. It's alive in the stories, artifacts, and community that supports it. In a place where submarines still deploy from just across the river, the connection runs deep. Well, that's going to wrap up our journey through the history of Nassau County. From the battlefields of the American Revolution to the tribal beats of the Gullah Geechee, history is alive and well on Florida's northeast coast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Scott Feiss. I look forward to seeing you again down the road for the next edition of Florida Road Trip. Until then, safe travels, everyone.
This program is brought to you in part by the Paul B. Hunter and Constance D. Hunter Charitable Foundation, a proud partner of WUCF and the Central Florida community.